if there's going to be, I think, one lasting legacy of COVID with respect to work, it's that in the past, our personal lives have revolved around our work lives. We're now demand that our work lives revolve around our personal lives, and we'll quit if we don't get that from our employer.
I'm here now with Mr. Phil Simon, the author of Reimagining Collaboration. Phil, we'll get into it right away. What is collaboration? Let's start there.
Hi, Benjamin. Thanks for having me on. At a high level, it's just working with someone to get something done. It's that simple. But many times people conflate terms. And in chapter 2 of the book, I talk about collaboration, but there are these cartoons that I wanted to put in so they'd be very obvious to folks. But that's different than coordination or project management or productivity. I can be productive by myself without being collaborative, right? So there are all these adjacent terms that I felt compelled to define, because if you're writing a book about a subject, you should probably find it. And one of the closest areas to collaboration is communication, which again, at a high level means to make something common. In 2015, I wrote a book about business communication called Message Not Received. And it was kind of natural for me, after writing Slack and Zoom for Dummies, to write a book about collaboration, because in an asynchronous world with remote work and hybrid work, it's tough to get things done. I'd argue that many projects didn't succeed even in the old world, 9 to 5, I could tap you on the shoulder, same time zone, same workplace, whatever. So all these factors that are complicating things, and I just don't see us ever going back exclusively to the pre-COVID world of work. So I felt compelled to write the book, and I'm glad that it found an audience.
On that note, we've had these tools like Zoom, Slack, Microsoft Teams. We've had these for a while now. Zoom's been around for years, but it wasn't until March 2020 that most people even knew what Zoom was. So we've had these tools, and we know that there's clear benefits to them. Why weren't companies using them every day?
Well, lots of reasons. There's nothing like forced adoption, right? People still send faxes in some cases. In the mortgage industry, I know you haven't most likely bought a home yet, but some of those organizations, institutions, and business processes are stuck in the Stone Age. Now, that's a broad statement. Zoom had pre-pandemic 10 million primarily business customers. So when people started using Zoom, they equated it to Skype, which at one point sported 650 million users. It's actually fascinating to me that people didn't go to Skype, they went to Zoom. I've got some theories on that, but I'll answer your question. People hate change. That's basically the sum total of my life experience. The management thinker Peter Senge famously said, people hate change unless it's their idea. So they didn't have the option anymore to talk to someone. So I guess we'll have to use Zoom. Microsoft Teams, I think they just announced that they hit 300 million monthly active users. Slack had plateaued at about 15 million daily active users before Salesforce gobbled it up for $28 billion. So the techniques are there, and there are startups and younger tech companies and web design firms, digital agencies that have, to your point, Benjamin, been using these tools, but the average worker didn't know about them. And if they were using Slack or Zoom or Microsoft Teams, they were really just touching the tip of the iceberg. So I felt compelled to write a book that would explain to people the benefits of not only using these internal collaboration hubs, but stitching them together with third-party applications that I call spokes in a much more cohesive way. One of my favorite stats I've come across in the last year is from Okta, the identification company. And it depends on the organization, it depends on the industry, but it's not uncommon for organizations to use anywhere from 80 to 170 tools or web services throughout the organization. Well, what if you could connect those in a way that didn't overwhelm you or didn't make you spend 3 hours looking for something because you couldn't find it? So it's been really interesting since the book came out, paying attention to what's going on, because I do think that conceptually, this book, I don't want to be arrogant, but pretty much nails it. And I was unaware of all the future of work books coming out, or the ones that were out, that took this particular approach around collaboration and workplace tech.
Zoom was our default everything. You would join classes via Zoom, and then it wasn't until because I graduated, went to a different school. They use Google Meet. I got exposure to that for a full year using that 5 hours a day. And that definitely helped bridge that gap, especially to younger people. So I guess let's get into a real case study. Let's take a student my age, around 15 years old, and he's in a school project. It's about designing a better iPhone, and they want to build a better phone for the future. And they have to, over a few months, design it, find ways to present it, put together a small business plan. But they're starting from like only working in class, but they have access to these tools. As an expert on reimagining collaboration, how do you go about kind of transitioning this group from only interacting in person, which is limiting at most, to being able to create a digital environment to be a lot more productive?
Project that you took on as a student?
No, I haven't done this project. No, this is just a idea. Yeah.
As we had, I'm a former college professor, and many times the students would undertake semester-long projects in groups, specifically for that. So, look, ideally you can meet in person at least once. It's a lot harder to demonize someone, right? If you've had lunch with them or played chess or what basketball, doesn't matter. A large problem, I think, today with social media stems from the fact that we are slamming people without having met them. If you've met someone, it's tougher to do that. Now, if you can't meet in person, um, we've got these tools, but again, people are just using the bare minimum. They don't know, for instance, that you can use a whiteboarding tool like Miro in Zoom, not just by sharing a screen, but by actually installing that app inside of Zoom. Zoom just passed 1,000, actually, it was a year ago, time flies, 1,000 third party apps. But if you only look at Zoom through the lens of being a video tool like Skype 2.0, you can't get your head around that. But if you say, no, this is a collaboration hub. So I've got a need for whiteboards. I've got a need for project management. I've got a need for note taking, for productivity, for recording, for transcription, and all of a sudden for polling, right? For reminders, for all these different things. Then you go, well, all right, then that kind of makes sense. There's more to it than I thought. And not to mention the Zoom rooms. So if you are meeting in person, and let's say you and I are meeting, and then you're from Los Angeles, so I'll just say that Kobe and Shaq have to dial in. We could actually use the whiteboard; they could see it, and it's not quite the same as being in there. Although companies like Zoom and Google and Microsoft are working on that, but it's better than way before your time. People in the late '90s, if you're in a consulting gig and someone had to call in, you're all sitting around a conference table, and that person was just a voice coming from a black box, and that person could not read the room, had very little presence, would miss out on all sorts of nonverbal cues. So if you're using these tools, again, I'm a big believer in occasionally meeting. And there are companies like Automatic, the company behind WordPress that runs 42% of the web. I'm sure you've heard of that one. Once a year, at least prior to the pandemic, they'd get everyone from around the world to fly to Greece or wherever because they wanted to meet people. Even though I'm a big fan of doing things from your house or working from anywhere on a beach in Maui with whatever Wi-Fi speeds you can get, um, there are limitations to doing that. And I think a lot of people make the mistake. I do believe in remote work, but I also believe that the future will be hybrid to an extent. I don't know if that's 1 day or 2 day a week or 1 day a month or 2 days a quarter, 1 day a year. But we're going to go into offices to meet our colleagues, to have conversations with our bosses, to brainstorm, to have fun. I read a Wall Street Journal article a couple of weeks ago about how the future office is more of a clubhouse. So a little bit like those co-working spaces that might have a keg. Not that I'm endorsing underage drinking, but a place for you to really go and do something that you couldn't do if it were just a row of desks and your manager was watching you work. And things like flexible workspaces, things like TVs next to people in meetings, so it's almost like they were there. I've even seen things like holograms. I'm not going to go full metaverse yet, but the future of work is really interesting. Ditto for project management, ditto for the office. So if there's going to be, I think, one lasting legacy of COVID with respect to work. It's that in the past, our personal lives have revolved around our work lives. We're now demand that our work lives revolve around our personal lives, and we'll quit if we don't get that from our employer.
I guess a big part of that, and I definitely really love that idea of a workplace being more of a clubhouse because you can do a lot of your normal work at home in the comfort of your own house. But an obstacle to that is that there is an inherent loneliness even through a Zoom screen. You can't communicate that human interaction through a screen. What would you kind of say to that and how to respond to the lonely aspect of remote work?
It's another reason that we ought to be getting together once in a while. Yes, it's great that I don't have to stare at a screen all day or commute. The average pre-pandemic American commute was 35 minutes. Think about the amount of time that you save by not having to do that. If you were to go to work 5 days a week, you're talking about an hour 10 a day, 6 hours a week, 300 and whatever hours per year, depending on how much vacation you take. Imagine that much time that you get back to spend with your loved ones, to go for a walk, to play tennis, to go to yoga, to meditate, to read books, whatever, right? But no, I'm completely with you. I do think that companies are investing in different types of offices, even satellites. So let's say that you live in a suburb of Los Angeles, company headquarters is in Los Angeles, but you might have a collaboration center or a co-working agreement so that you could get together with colleagues who happen to live 15 minutes away as opposed to battling Los Angeles traffic, which is never fun. So yeah, that's why it's another reason that I do think that things will be hybrid. If it's exclusively remote, I mean, even if it were a hologram, it's just not the same. It's like streaming a concert versus being there. I went to see, have you ever heard of the band Dream Theater? You're making me feel old. And I went to a concert 2 weeks ago, wore a mask the whole time here in Arizona, and I had a good time. And, it just was cool seeing live music versus going on YouTube and saying, I want to hear The Count of Tuscany by Dream Theater, which I can do, but there's not as much serendipity. I like not knowing what the band's going to play or that type of thing. So I'm completely with you. I would not want to only interact with a computer all day long. Zoom fatigue is a very real thing. In fact, even as we're recording this in Zencaster, I don't believe that Zencaster lets you hide your own um, webcam, but I want you to see me. So I shifted over myself. So I'm looking at you. I'm not on the right hand side looking at me because that will, over the course of the day, contribute to Zoom fatigue. I'm not a neuroscientist, but they will tell you it is not natural to look at yourself when you talk.
Yeah, that is a really, really interesting thing. And I agree. I mean, the best way to combat loneliness in a remote environment is to just meet up more once in a while. And in a clubhouse environment, as opposed to a working office, is a great way to do that. And something that I really find interesting in your book, you talk about how these new collaborative tools kind of emerge from the bottom down. The employees all kind of use these tools, and then the upper level, or the opposite, or from a mid level. And I, for one, have gone through this where I'm in a group project and like, oh, there's this really cool tool called Slack that we can all use. It'll help us out and we can communicate so much better, be more productive. But everyone's no, it's too complicated. Let's just, even though it is significantly more productive, how can we kind of convince others of these? Maybe they're slightly more complicated, but drastically more productive tools.
I mean, I'd argue they're not that much more complicated, right? If so, one of the tricks I'd use if I consulted older folks who were concerned about a new technology is to say, "Come on, you got this. You kids remember AOL, right? Well, this is just a similar version to that, and not necessarily with Slack, but no, it's a real problem. As I said before, people hate change. As a college professor, I could compel my students to use Slack because I'd say, "I'm not responding to your email. Pretend I don't have an email address. It doesn't exist." Well, none of my other professors do that. Well, I'm not them. So if you want me to respond to a message, I will do it in Slack. Now, for your group project, you can use whatever you want, but don't expect me to get forwarded your WhatsApp or your Snapchat and me to respond because I'm not giving you my phone. I'm keeping everything in Slack that's going to keep me sane. Ideally, people will buy into the benefits, as you said. Ideally, the company will invest in training. Many times they don't. They expect employees to pick it up on their own, and it's too confusing, and they don't understand it, or they only understand part of it, and then they do it wrong, and then before you know it, it's a mess. So companies could invest in training. Um, so I'm a big believer in the carrots, but if that doesn't work, then you have to consider the stick, right? And this is not just an entry level person who doesn't want to learn Slack or Microsoft Teams. This is the executive who says, "Yeah, I'm 58 years old. I am not learning anything new. I'm retiring in 4 years." Well, think about the message that you're sending to everyone underneath you. Think about that person getting basically a hall pass and not using it. And another executive says, "Well, how come he doesn't get to use it? I don't get to use it, or I have to use it." Right. So if people aren't on board with that, then you have the conversation. And when I was in Las Vegas in 2014, I talked to a startup founder and we were talking about tools and they said use Slack and we loved it, but we had to fire someone. I said, fire someone? Why? Did a person send around an inappropriate picture? No, she wouldn't use Slack. She kept sending email. It derailed our projects and our company's progress. Every time we had to go searching for something, we were looking multiple places and we had a number of discussions with her and she just wouldn't do it and we said goodbye. And that's okay. I was just reading a really good protocol article about how now employees are now interviewing employers on the tools they use. So if you only use email internally, guess what? Right? You are going to be spending your day in your inbox. And that's just not something that a lot of people who are particularly in demand right now want to do. Or in some cases, and this is my favorite, you have people saying, I'm a Slack person, right? I'm not using Teams. So I don't care if your compensation is good, the opportunity meets my skill set. I use Slack. It's part of my identity. It'd be like saying, well, you have to use an Android. Well, I'm an iPhone person, right? Or, in your neck of the woods, being a Rams fan, saying, okay, well, you have to root for the Raiders. I don't like the Raiders. I like the Rams. Well, I'm not going to work for you. So I do think that we're going to see employees self-select, for lack of a better term. And if a company conducts the hiring process through Slack or Teams and automates it, and that employee won't do those types of things, then take with a 15 bag of salt the employee's answer when he or she says, yeah, I'm collaborative. No, you're not. You're not using the tools. So again, I think that people are going to self-select into different pockets, much the same way you might say, I want to work on Wall Street. I want to work in Silicon Valley. I want to work in consumer products company Midwest. It won't be the only reason, but if I've got two job offers and they're the same, and one company's collaboration and technology is a mess, right, and the other company seems to do it well, it doesn't mean that the other place is perfect. But if I have no other information, I'm taking that second job any day of the week and twice on Sunday.
The college you taught at was it was Arizona State University, right? And ASU was named like the most innovative school in America for what 6 years.
Yeah, they're not too shy about broadcasting that. They have it on buses and billboards, and not just in Arizona. I think there's even a Los Angeles satellite campus. And then Dr. Crow, who's the president of the school, recently announced plans to educate 100 million people by 2027 for obvious reasons. Most of that will be virtual or digital or asynchronous or all the above. So yeah, the moral of the story there is that even ostensibly innovative organizations struggle with change. And if the most innovative university, according to U.S. News and World Report, for 6 straight years does, and we can talk about that if you want, but what does that say for the conservative government organization that's still running a green screen? Right? Are they going to be open to new ideas? Because this stuff isn't that complicated, right? I wrote long books about Slack and Zoom. As I'm fond of saying, I'm not a rocket surgeon, but my job was to learn those tools, right? So I spent a long time looking at the features, testing it, making mistakes. But in many organizations, they don't want to change what isn't really broken in their mind. And then before you know it, they're dis they're irrelevant or they've been disintermediated. So, if people can work anywhere, I would argue that it's a basic retention tool. You don't want your employees working 14 hours a day. Asana released a study last April, the Anatomy of Work Index, and they found that around 31% of the time, US based employees were working on work. In other words, they were trying to schedule meetings, they were trying to find documents. That's a biggie. They were creating duplicate documents or just confused. That sucks, right? I don't want to work in that environment, bad day, bad week, whatever, but I want my work to matter, particularly your generation, from what I understand of it. You want to have meaning in what you do. You don't want your job to be duplicate data entry or trying to find something routinely. Again, if something breaks bad, that's one thing, but your job should be interesting and challenging to you. And so I would argue that hopefully enough companies will realize that this is an opportunity to build a decidedly better future of work, and collaboration tools are a huge part of that. Not everything, but I fail to see how you embrace remote or hybrid work without a solid understanding of these tools. This isn't about doing email better.
I really agree, definitely, and we know that the world constantly changes, and those who can't change, the companies, the organizations, the people that can't change fall behind, and that's they lose. Yep. And so my last question to you is, like I said, we hear so many articles. The future of work. This is the future of work. Imagine a world where work life revolves around personal life. 4 day work weeks. What's your vision for what work, quote unquote work, will look like in 10, 20 years?
Well, it's funny you mention that because in the last chapter of the book, not to give it away, the butler did it. That's a joke. Uh, Tough crowd. Anyway, I envision these tools playing an enormous role. For example, if you consistently use these hubs and tie together spokes, they will know what matters to you, even if you don't. So, one of my favorite quotes researching the book was from Stuart Butterfield, the CEO of Slack, now part of Salesforce. And he said, imagine Slack as your always on chief of staff that answers questions you didn't think to ask. Boom, mind blown. So this isn't just about Benjamin, this is urgent. Oh, well, guess it's urgent. Well, that's not necessarily the case. What if the tools were not sentient? That's not going to happen, I think, hopefully anytime soon, but aware enough that they'd be able to detect patterns and tell you about them, right? So even though you might be a morning person, what if Slack notifies you, or Microsoft Teams or Zoom or what the hell is Facebook calling it now? Workplace by, oh, sorry, Meta. They keep changing. Or Google Workspace. What if they've got enough data and intelligence in there that they could identify nascent trends? What if I could see that even though I think as your manager, Benjamin's fine, there's an indication in the data that you actually might be zoning out or checking out, right? And you haven't responded in Slack as much, you haven't logged in as much, your comments have been less positive, you're using fewer emojis, whatever. As your manager, wouldn't I want to know that? I can't stop you from leaving, right? But wouldn't I want to know? Or even perhaps a better example, one from the book, let's say that you're a business analyst making $50,000 a year, and that's your formal business title, that's your salary, and that's very much in line with what you think business analysts ought to make, not only within your company but outside. Well, that business analyst comes up to you and says, I'm turning in my resignation, I got an offer for another company to work for 60,000, so that's a 20% raise. Historically, managers might have said, okay, I understand, or best of luck to you. What if the Slack or one of these other hubs could tell you, and things like network analysis, that person who makes $50,000 a year, irrespective of her job description and her title and her place on the org chart and all those things that people have historically viewed, what if that tool could tell you actually that person's much more valuable? She's involved in all these other projects in an informal way. She is at the center of these very informal but powerful networks. Now, you still may not be able to pay her $60,000, but wouldn't you want that information before you decided? That's my own particular take and how I kind of conclude the book. I think that could be an absolute game changer for companies because, as someone with an HR background, we let good people walk all the time. And this was pre-COVID. And now when you've got people staring at screens and Zoom fatigue and dealing with all these notifications from all these different apps, and they can leave right, without having to move, uh, I honestly, I mean, hopefully I wrote a conceptual book that people will look back at in 5 to 10 years and say this guy was onto something, and not just a guide like Slack and Zoom for Dummies that's completely outdated because software changes so quickly. So that's how I see the future of work in the context of your question.
That definitely is super, super interesting, somewhat scary in a way, but it does make sense to be able to utilize these tools now that it's hard to quantify your real life interactions, measure your meeting based on positivity, but it is a lot more possible to do these via Slack, via Zoom, where you can quantify these. Thank you so much, Phil, for coming on the show today. It was great having you.
Hey, Benjamin, thanks for having me. Stay safe.